Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Iain Duncan Smith, when he was Tory leader, told us the Conservatives did not want to leave the European Union. A long time ago, of course, and his own hostility to Brussels has become ever more obvious since then. Unlike Michael Gove or Boris Johnson, David Cameron was never in much doubt that IDS would come out for Brexit. Well, so he has. And I pick up my paper today, Mr. Duncan Smith, and I read you saying, they can sack me, but Europe goes over everything. Is it going to come to that?
Like everything else, I was responding to a question, and the answer is that my country comes first always before jobs, careers, or anything else. I've always said that I'm here, it's a vocation, it's not a career. And
but it wasn't an invitation to sack you?
No, it's not for me to invite anybody to sack me or not.
Right.
My sense about this is such a huge issue, it's a big issue. The Prime Minister, to be fair, deserves credit for allowing the Cabinet to disagree and to campaign, and that is a sense of strength rather than weakness, I think.
Well, let's turn to the huge issue itself. It seems that the biggest thing that people want to know about all of this is our terms of trade if we leave the EU. Are you in favour of us staying inside a single European market?
I'm in favour of us having a proper arrangement which allows us to access the marketplace as they exist at the moment. It's worth remembering...
Sorry, that's not quite an answer.
No, I'm going to answer because this is important. It's worth remembering that nowhere in the treaties is the single European market in any way defined. So those who talk about an entity are wrong. There is no entity called the single European market. There is just a series of issues in Europe about trade and relationships. And so what I believe that we ought to be able to do is to arrange our affairs with the European Union as the fifth largest economy, such that we would get access to those matters that we now refer to as the single European market, and trade and cooperate with them in a reasonable way, but not be bound by a whole series of internal regulations, because 95% of all business in Britain does not trade with the European Union, but has to imbibe all the regulations that come from the European Union, costing them extra money and real problems about time and concerns about their ability to do revenue as a result of that.
According to the latest official figures, 50% of our trade is with the EU. Do you accept that as a figure?
Well, be very careful again. What we've seen with the 50% is that there's a whole bunch of trade in there, which is what you call rebadge trade. For example, a company that makes wings for an aircraft that is being exported to Kuwait, that's not European trade, that's trade that's going through Europe and outwards. So it's probably nearer around the early 40s, 41, 42% of trade that goes to the European Union. Yes, it's an important trading partner.
Pretty big. And the amount of trade coming back, again, according to the ONS figures, from them to us is about 13%.
Well, there's debates about that, 13, 16%. But yes, so
there is a big gap. So the question is, therefore, why would they give us fantastic?
I don't think it's a gap at all. You've got to look at this in terms of who's trading and why. So that percentage of trade coming from the UK is vitally important to the European Union. Why? Because it is a huge element of their trade on manufacturers. If you look at Germany, for example, we are Germany's third largest trading partner. We're about 1% behind their greatest, which is France. So France, America, America is their second largest trading partner. And, they're not in a single market. They're not in the European Union. We are the third one. So my point here is that Germany, selling cars, machine tools, Scandinavia, I was in a hospital the other day and I was in their operating theatre. I looked around. There were products in there that were not made in Britain, but were made in Sweden inside our operating theatre. So they have a real requirement to trade with us, a desperate one, and we will do trade with them.
Let me come back to my original question, is the single European market. It may not be an entity, but it is a process. It's the system by which protectionism inside Europe is basically crushed by the bureaucracy to our advantage. This is why Margaret Thatcher was always in favour of the EU all the way through as Prime Minister, and she was very, very specific about the Single European Act and the Single European market. She loved the idea. I can read you a quote. You'd probably like me to. Just think for a minute, she said, what a prospect that is, a single market without barriers, visible or invisible, giving you direct and unhindered access to the purchasing power of over 300 million of the world's wealthiest and most prosperous people. Now, the number's gone up, of course, but isn't that a fair point? She was right about that.
Yes, and I talked to her when I got elected at length about this, and she also said to me categorically that she'd been utterly misled said about the Single European Act. She was told that it was about the marketplace, but later she has realized that it actually was about a political union. It's worth knowing something here, which the public needs to understand, is I think we always debate the single market. Europe has a distinct desire to have us trade with them and we with them. That's a fact of life. It doesn't matter in or out. We are going to trade with the European Union. But this is the point. Europe is not, the European Union is not about the trade issue. The European Union was set up by the founding fathers, an important man called Spinelli, an Italian, who was an ex-communist. He designed the Maastricht and the Single European Act. Why? Because he said this is a political project. It is about bringing the nations of Europe closer and closer together to create a place called Europe. And the design of this was such that politicians who come and go, he said, could not actually override the decisions of the bureaucracy, because otherwise we would never get there.
Though we are now out of the ever closer union bit of all of this, of course.
Well, that's debatable.
Let me return to the original point, which we're still circling around, which is, what is the deal that you think we could realistically negotiate with the rest of the EU once we had left? What is the nature of that trading deal?
The trade deal is very simply that we would want them to be able to access our market freely, without special and extra tariffs. We would want to be able to access their marketplace. But we'd also want something else, which I think they have never delivered. You talk about the single European market. The market in financial trade is not complete by a long way. It is still highly difficult for British companies in the financial sector to trade directly in Germany. All sorts of barriers are put up there, and the same goes for France. So what we'd want to know...
Outside, we can't affect that.
Yes, but even inside, we have had how many years now since the Single European Act? Something in the order of 30, and we have not affected that either. In fact, quite the opposite, as we saw recently, new regulations piling in on the city, which made it more difficult for them to trade with the rest of the world. So there is no question
to be clear, we would get a two-way free trade deal, which would get us into the Single European Act, but without free movement of people and without a financial entrance fee.
So in our discussion,
a better deal than any EU country has got, we would get after leaving. Why would they give us that?
Yes, because the rest of the EU signs up to the political project. This is the key bit that I come back to. For most of the countries of the European Union, they believe in this political project. We do not. You know, if you go to Europe, and I have, large of my family have been living in Italy, I've studied out there, they don't talk about the marketplace. There has never been a debate in Europe amongst countries about access to the marketplace. They talk about the political project. They talk about Europe as a European Union being an entity, it having a political identity, a citizenship.
I agree with that, but that being the case, we leave, we slam the door in their faces, and then we say, we want a better deal for us than you've got for any of yourselves. Why would they do that? They'll be furious with us.
No, because they think categorically that they want the political project, and we don't. So my answer in all of this is very simple. Prime Minister says there is a challenge to know what life outside looks like.
Exactly.
My answer to this challenge is very simple. We do a deal with the European Union. That is a trade deal. It is about access to our markets, access to theirs. Part of our red lines will be about us being able to control the borders as we want. We'd want migration, but we want it as controlled migration so that we can cope with it. And that deal is very doable.
A very optimistic view of what would happen after Brexit.
Well, I tell you, I am an optimist, and I tell you why. Because the UK has faced bigger trials than this over its years. It stood alone in war, but it's also rediscovered and defined trade around the world through the free market, etc. These were British inventions. And I say this to those who say they want to remain in. I have never heard such a lot of pessimistic downsizing of Britain's aspects. You know, Britain is a phenomenal country, the 5th largest in the world. It has stood alone and fought for freedom. It has traded. It has been a global trader. It can yet again be a global trader. Why would we have such a low opinion of the British people that we go out and talk about leaping into the dark, we talk about profound shocks, we talk about them not being capable, that we're too small? I have a different view. My view is Britain is a great country. The people here are inventive, innovative, and they will find a way with us to actually have a real deal that gives Britain access to the world and access to Europe.
You don't think the Prime Minister's much of a patriot, do you?
Well, I don't see, for the In campaign, this is not about personalities, the In campaign's whole strategy seems to be about, oh, it's terrible, hang on to nurse for fear of something worse.
Talking down Britain.
It's been about saying, basically, we're too small, we're too little, we're too inconsequential, we can't do what we want. I don't know why anybody would want to run a country like this. This country is the greatest on earth, not because it's the biggest and it's the strongest, but because it has the most brilliant people. You know, it's the free market was designed by a Scotsman. You know, we have the
everything
English language
was designed by a Scotsman.
Well, you know, I'm a Scot, and I have to say I'm proud of being British and Scots and being able to trade with the rest of the world.
Let's talk a bit about migration, which is a huge issue for a lot of people as well. Isn't the truth that out there in the modern world, as we live it now, millions, billions of people around the world have mobile phones, very, very good access to technology. They know what life is like in the West. It is much, much easier than it ever was to travel around the world. Those two things put together mean that people who are in impoverished or dangerous circumstances are going to move. Whether the EU is there or not, there is global migration. Whether we're in or outside the EU, we will face the same issues.
Yes, of course we are. But then the key point is right now, we have no control over what happens when someone arrives in the European Union and gets leave to remain, passports, etc. They can come to the European Union. We also have no control over our borders with those members of the European Union.
Well, is that true?
Well, hang on a second. Let me just finish this point, because it's really important. We have utter chaos and crisis going on in the European Union over migration. Even their Schengen agreement now is falling apart. You've got Hungary putting up barbed wire. You've got the Macedonians refusing to accept anybody from Greece. This is a shambles.
No, it's hardly their fault, is it?
Well, no, but I'm saying...
This is a global shift.
People say we can't exist without the European Union. All I'm showing you is if this is the future with the European Union, then why aren't we... We'd be better off being able to say, this is how we're going to cope. We're not against migrancy. This country has accepted refugees down the ages, and I'm proud of that.
And the numbers of people from outside the EU coming to this country have rocketed under your government.
Yes, well, we have actually been controlling that. To be fair to Theresa, she's actually got that right down from where it was before. But the reality is we can't control from the European Union. All I'm saying is, if you want to know what the future looks like, this is my challenge to those who say vote to remain in. They say, what is it going to look like outside?
Yeah.
Control of our borders? I can tell you, we will control the numbers that come in and for what reason. But if you go and stay on in, what you have got is chaos and confusion. You don't know that this isn't going to collapse. You don't know the euro, for example, which is already now causing chaos and collapse.
We don't know
where we're going to be in 2 years' time.
We know where the chaos
by remaining in.
We know where the chaos is. We know where the confusion is. It's in Calais. It's in the jungle camp in Calais. Once we leave the EU, what is to stop the French saying, OK, on you go? All those people coming into the EU from other parts of the world wanting to come to Britain, there's no reason for the French or anybody else to stop them coming here. What do we do then?
This is another one of those great scare stories put out by the Remain in people.
Not a scare story.
Oh, it is a scare story.
It's what Cazeneuve, the French Interior Minister, has said as much.
Yeah, OK, actually, they should check with the French first. The reality is that the French would not do a deal. This was a bilateral deal done with the French. They would not have done that deal with us if it didn't suit them. Of course it suited them. If you remember, before the deal, there were even a greater number of people sitting around on Calais, and there was no agreement about processing them in France. It suited the French to get the processing done there. It has actually meant that it has been better organized than it was before. It's hit a bit of a problem now. Why? Because the European borders have collapsed, allowing people coming through.
Local and national politicians in France have said that if we leave, they will simply let people go through the tunnel and come into the UK in large numbers. And my question is, what do we do then? Do we have a jungle in Kent, or what happens?
Look, you know, we control it whichever way we have to, but I have to say to you, that is not going to happen. It's not going to happen because it does not suit the French. The moment they do that, they will treble their numbers that will be hanging around in France, in Calais. They know that to be the case, which is why they did the original deal. The original deal was done bilaterally. It had nothing to do with the European Union.
How does it damage the French if people just come straight through and arrive
because
in
it invites more people to come through into France.
They're only passing through.
Yeah, but that's exactly the point. They end up in France, and they know very well that while they're in France, they're doing all sorts of various
But under the new deal, they would be in England rather than in France.
Well, what I'm saying to you is under the new deal, they would still be where they are because it suits France. My point is, if you think that we cannot fingers crossed, let's France tomorrow.
Sorry, we've got so much to talk about.
What's to stop France tomorrow saying, go to UK now when we're not going to do it? Nothing. We have no power in the European Union to stop them.
They haven't yet.
But they could easily.
Now, the other thing is, you're a unionist. What happens if Scotland leaves the UK as a result of a Brexit vote? Are you not worried about that?
Look, I think everything else, you vote for what is in front of you. What is in front of us now is whether or not we should remain in the European Union. And the reality for Scotland is they've had a referendum in Scotland. I was passionately pro the Union, and I believe they voted for that. I think those who are running around saying somehow that if Britain votes to stay in and Scotland decides they want to go, they have another referendum.
Yeah.
I think Scotland doesn't want another referendum because they are settled, and I think the
opinion polls in Scotland now are pro-leaving the UK. Nicola Sturgeon, who has complete control, really, of the Scottish political system, says it will happen if we have Brexit. She said it on that sofa, as it were, digitally down the line, and I see no reason to think that it won't happen.